Hi, this is Thomas from Apex Game Tools. In this video we're going to look at grouping and grouping strategies. Grouping and grouping strategies is a new concept in Apex Path 2.0. Now steering in Apex Path is not really geared towards group movement. For that you would need to write your own more advanced steering behaviors for group movement or use Apex Steer. And grouping is used extensively in Apex Steer. But in this video we're going to go through how groups are made and what group strategies are and how you create them. Groups can be created in two ways. One way is if you have users or selectable units that users can select using the mouse or other input devices. Once the user selects a group of units, they will become a group, or maybe multiple groups. You can also create groups for AI units through code, using pretty much the same methods that are used when selecting units. These groups are actually temporary groups. They only exist as long as units belong to them, and they're only there to facilitate group movement. So it's not something that you would use to create your own squads and so forth. They are there to be able to move units, stop units, and so forth. So they basically exhibit the same behavior as a single unit. So you can ask a group to move somewhere, ask it to stop, set its preferred speed, and so forth. Now the default behavior in Apex Path is that when you select a group of units, just one single group is created with all the units in it. This may be fine for your needs, but we have the concept of grouping strategies. And a grouping strategy allows you to actually create multiple groups when selecting units, so that units that have different capabilities will be in different groups. For instance, some groups may be able to fly, may be able to scale heights that other units cannot, and so forth. So let's have a quick look at this. So here we have a simple scene with 4 units, as you can see, 2 different kinds, 2 orange units and 2 green units. Now they differ in color, but they also differ in their attributes, which we'll get back to in just a sec. So let's just start the scene. We have an obstacle in our way, as you can see, and then we have a target up here, which we actually won't be using right now because I'm just going to select these units and I'm going to point them over here, other side of the wall, and have them move there. Now we don't have any unit avoidance, as you can see, but as you can see, the green units move around the wall, whereas the orange units just walk straight through the wall. The default behavior, as mentioned, is that this group is just one group, and the default group behavior is that each unit in the group will get a separate path. So this is why, well, they each have their own individual path, so they will path the way that they can according to their capabilities. So for the general steering in Apex Path, this is fine because it is basically single unit movement. But when dealing with actual groups, you will probably want slightly different behavior. So let's just have a quick look at the units. So as I mentioned, they have different attributes, just using the default example attributes that you've probably seen in other videos. So like the orange unit has the attribute on orange team, and the green unit has an attribute on green team. And this obstacle in the center here, it has an exception of orange team, so that means that orange units will simply ignore it and just move straight through it. Now let's say we want to create a group that behaves a little bit different. So instead of having a group that actually requests a path for each of the units in the group, which obviously has a toll on the Pathfinder, it actually has to have 4 paths, one for each unit. If we instead wanted to simply have one path for all the 4 units, we could do that by creating a custom group. So let's switch to code view and look at that. So here we have created a custom group. As you can see, it derives from the default transient unit group. That is the one I talked about before, that has this default behavior that it will create a path for each of the units in the group. So now what we've done here is, instead of doing that, I actually issue one request. In this case, I'm using the model unit of the group. That is just by default, it's just the first unit in the group. This can also be changed if you want. But we have used the model unit to create a path request, and then we give that path to all of the units. Basically just cloning the same path and telling the units to move along this clone. This means that the path will only be created once by the Pathfinder, and then they will just each receive a clone. So in order to then use this group, we also have to change the group strategy. The default grouping strategy will create this default transient unit group when it creates groups, but we wanted to create this group type. So for that, we've also created a strategy named the same as our group. And there are a few things to note about this one here. Now, I've created this as a mono behavior. I'll come back to why. There's no reason to do that. You can easily split these two things up if you want to do so. The strategy simply needs to implement this interface here, iGrouping strategy. The type of that, the generic type, will be iUnitFacade. And if you haven't already seen that video, you should probably do that, about the unit facade, which represents the unit's capabilities. So this grouping strategy requires you to implement 3 methods. One is to create a grouping. A grouping, we'll get back to in a sec, has to do with how units are split into different groups. The create group is the one that actually creates the group type that you want to use. So this is where we actually return our one path for all group that we want to use. And finally, the grouping strategy has a method to evaluate if 2 units should belong to the same group. Now, in order to change the strategy from the default one to this new one, you have 2 options. You can do this manually somewhere in your initialization code, calling the grouping manager and simply registering your strategy. That will then use that strategy instead of the default one. Doing it that way also allows you to change strategies at runtime if you want to do that. Now we've gone with the second option, which is to create a factory for the strategy so that you can actually define the strategy override at design time. And this is what the second interface is for. As you can see, it's called factory, and I've implemented it here in the same class as the strategy itself, but as I said, you could easily split these two up so that the factory is a separate component and the strategy is a separate class. But just for simplicity, we've just put them in the same class here. And that factory interface just has one single method that creates the strategy. In this case, since it is the same class, we just return a reference to this. Now to see that in action, we will have to attach it to our game world. It needs to be on the game world because the initialization script that is using the strategy is expected to be here. So I'm just going to add this component. And this is the one we want. So there we go. Now that it is on, we can start our scene and we should have this new strategy in place. So now when I create my group, it will actually be this new group that is created, and when I ask it to go somewhere, as you can see, they actually all move through the wall, even though the green units actually cannot. Obviously this is because they all got the same route, and since the model unit is one of the orange units, they have all gotten a path that leads straight through the wall, basically ignoring other members' capabilities. So in this case, that is probably not what we want. But what if we still want to have the functionality that in a given group we still only get one path for all the members in the group, but we still want to respect the individual members' capabilities? Now this is again where the strategy comes in. The strategy will allow you to divide units into different groups based on whatever capabilities they have. So that could be anything that you want, any properties on your unit that you can decide whether they should belong to one group or another. Could be their, height capabilities, how much can they climb, their attributes, or any other thing that you could think of. Now, in the example that I'm going to show you now, we are using the attributes of the units. So let's have a look at that. So instead of this one path for all strategy, we're going to look at an attribute-based strategy. Now this is going to be a little more advanced. So we have two options in this. As you can see, this is now we have to look at the method called create grouping instead of the method we saw before, create group. Actually, the create grouping was used before as well, but it was. You can just go back quickly. As you can see, create grouping actually did the exact same thing as create group. It just created one group for all the members. We no longer want that. We actually want a group for each type of unit. So we want a group for the orange units and we want a group for the green units. And then we want to issue a move request to each of these groups. Now, so what we're going to do is basically divide them into these two groups, and I've done that here in a kind of verbose form. As you can see, I have a dictionary to keep track of groups already instantiated. I'm creating a grouping. This is what I want to return, grouping of units. And then I loop through my units, see if I already have a group for that unit's attribute type. If I do, I'll add it. If I don't, I'll just create that group and add it to my grouping. And finally, I can return my grouping. Now I've created a somewhat cleaner solution up here using link that you can look at if you want. It may be a little bit less verbose, it is, but maybe also a little bit more difficult to follow. That's up to you how you want to do it. So this unit also implements the other methods, obviously. This one is the same as before. It just creates one path for all group. And the method that evaluates whether or not we belong to the same group. Now this time you actually have something to evaluate, and what distinguishes units from each other is their attributes. So basically If they belong to the same group, that means their attributes must be the same. So let's see how that works. So we can only have one strategy active at any given time, so I'm just going to remove this one and then I'm going to add the other one. There we go. So now we're going to try that again, and now, as you can see, we actually have the units moving as we expect, but they only get one path per group. So for the orange units we will only have one path, and for the green units there will only be one path that both of them will follow. So in total we have now issued 2 path requests. So that was all I have to say about selecting units, strategies for selecting units, using input devices and such. But we'll also have to look at how you can actually interact with these things for your AI units. So how do you create groups for your AI units, or groupings for them, and how do you actually ask them to go places. So for that I've created a small example, as you probably saw before. It's attached down here, and let's look at some code. So we have 4 small scripts that we're going to look at, 3 different ways of spawning groups, and a way of spawning groupings. Now the first one up here, for all of them actually we're going to spawn 6 units, 3 orange units and 3 green units. And these scripts simply show different ways of doing this. So in the first one we're going to use the grouping manager. Now this is one way to do it. The grouping manager will use the grouping strategy to create groups. So if you change or plan to change groups, grouping strategies at runtime, this is the way to do it, because then he will actually, or the grouping manager will respect whatever grouping strategy is active at the time. So as you can see, we simply in this case create a group manually, one for the orange units and one for the green units, and then we just make a loop here and instantiate the units, add them to the group. As you can see, what we add is not the game object itself, but we add the unit facade of that game object to represent the unit. And then, as you can see, we can call various methods on the group. Groups basically implement the same interfaces as units do for movement, so the iMovable interface and the iMoving object interface are implemented by groups as well. So all the same methods are available. So we just ask them to move to our target, and that's basically it. So I've bound this to a few keybinds. You won't be able to see that in the video, but I'm now pressing Q, and then that will spawn my units, and as you can see, well, they're going to move towards the target. So let's look at the second option. Another way to spawn units is to actually, if you already have the units on hand, you may have a reference, and you may have your own squads or whatever, and you want to create moving groups for those. You can simply use that overload instead, where you actually pass a list of our unit facades to the grouping manager, and then again call move to. Finally, well, the simplest way basically is to obviously create the group specifically. So if you want to use one path for all group, you can simply create an instance of that, and then you can do the exact same thing as before, just add them to the group and then ask them to move somewhere. Of course, this doesn't work very well if you have strategies that change at runtime, but if you don't, then this will probably be the best option, or simplest option basically. So they all work exactly the same, they're just 3 different ways of doing it. Now finally, let's look at grouping, because you may have, this does the same thing as a grouping would do. You just do it yourself. You basically split up your units into an orange group and a green group. But if you have a big group already, a squad or whatever, and you want the grouping manager to actually figure out how to put them in different groups, you can do that as well. So here I'm instantiating 3 of each, so we'll just have a collection of 3 orange and 3 green. And then I'm asking the grouping manager to actually group these for me. So it will create a grouping, and a grouping is basically a group of groups. So once I have that, I'm going to loop through it, and then I'm going to ask each group to move to my target location. So that's basically it. We can end off by showing the last bit here. Spawning again groups. This is then spawned as groupings, and they do exactly the same as the others. So that's all about groupings. I hope it made sense. See you in the next video.